Okay, now let's talk about camera technical stuff. We're not going to spend too much time on framing and composition because our purposes are to show you how to produce a better online meeting or live stream. And generally speaking, your subject is going to be composed in the center of the frame. If you want to learn more about composition, Google the rule of thirds. There are hundreds of videos that explain this. Now let's talk about aperture, shutter speed, frame rate, and ISO. The aperture is a series of blades that move within the lens to let light in and to reduce the light. On a photography lens or a photographic lens, this is controlled by the camera. On a cinema lens, this is controlled manually. It's an easy concept to understand if you just think about how your eyes work. As you move between bright and dark environments, the iris in your eyes either expand or shrink, controlling the size of your pupil. The camera needs to know what the proper exposure is in every lighting environment. If you set your camera to auto, it'll do it automatically. However, if you want to make more professional looking videos, you'll want to adjust this manually. For example, if you want really shallow depth of field, making the stuff in the background blurry, you'll want to open your aperture wide. The wider your aperture, the shallower the depth of field. But now you'll have to reduce the light coming into the camera another way. You can do this with shutter speed, ISO, or an ND filter or a neutral density filter. Shutter speed is responsible for two particular things: changing the brightness of your photo or creating dramatic effects by either freezing action or blurring motion. Shutter speed exists because of the camera's shutter, which is a curtain in front of the camera's sensor that stays closed until the camera fires. When the camera fires, the shutter opens and fully exposes the camera sensor to the light that's passed through the lens. After the sensor is done collecting the light, the shutter closes immediately, stopping the light from hitting the sensor. There are many effects you can get with adjusting the shutter speed. However, I'm only going to show you how to set the shutter speed for studio situations. But before we do that, let's talk about frame rate. The most common frame rate is 24 FPS or frames per second. This is what most movies are shot in. Why is this? Because when the movie industry was in its infancy, films were shot on really expensive cellulose, and it's very expensive. The more frames that you used up, the more it cost. Somebody figured out that 24 frames per second was the slowest frame rate that still gives the viewer a sense of motion without looking too choppy. And since everyone started using 24 frames per second, it set a standard. And that's the look that you get. When you look at 24 frames per second, when you look at a flame, for example, it looks flickery and lovely and nice. And if you look at it at a higher frame rate, it just looks like a plain flame. Higher frame rates are great for capturing faster moving content, and for some reason soap operas from the 80s. Much of the content you see captured on smartphones is captured in 30 frames per second. If you want super clear, sharp looking video, then you want to capture in 60 frames per second. This is entirely subjective, and you'll just need to make the decision for what's best for what you're trying to accomplish. Now back to shutter speed. The general rule of thumb when setting shutter speed after you've decided on the frame rate is to set the shutter speed for double of what your frame rate is. If you want to film at 24 frames per second, you want to set your shutter speed to 48 or 1/48th of a second, or as close as your camera will allow. If you want to shoot at 30 frames per second, then you'll want to set your shutter speed to 60 or 1/60th of a second. And if you want to shoot at 60 frames per second, you'll want to set your shutter speed at 120 or 1/20th of a second, and so on. If you've set your frame rate, aperture, and your shutter speed but still don't have the exposure you're looking for, then consider using an ND filter. Think of an ND filter like sunglasses for your lens. They can be purchased online cheaply for around $22 or on the more professional end for around $180. Now let's talk about ISO or ISO. ISO stands for International Organization for Standardization. Now you can throw that out because the only time you'll ever use that is trying to impress somebody at a party. It controls how sensitive your camera's sensor is to light. The higher you set this, the brighter your exposure will be, and the lower you set this, the darker your exposure will be. Most cameras are designed with what's called a native ISO. That means it's the ideal setting for the optimal image. If you set your ISO much higher than the native ISO, then you'll start to reduce the quality of your image. There's several ways to measure for proper exposure, including histograms, false colors, zebras, and light meters. But for this series, we're only going to focus on the internal light meter that comes standard with most cameras, the DSLRs and the mirrorless cameras. The light meter is an internal function of the camera that gives you a visual indication of how dark or light an image is according to the camera. The light meter is the little thing that you see in the live view or through the viewfinder. Most cameras can change the range of the light meter from -3 to +3. When the cursor is at 0, this means according to the camera that's the right setting. If the cursor's to the left, it means the image is darker. And if the cursor's to the right, the image is lighter. The light meter sees a scene, the picture you point the camera at, as a whole bunch of different points of light, as if it was black and white. Each point is evaluated against the camera's 0, which is 18% gray. And this is 18% gray.